Okay.
So good morning, everybody, and so happy to be here again. We have the precious gift of having Dan Cozort with us, who is sharing his knowledge and wisdom about Buddhism and how Buddhists can inform us to tame the human activity on the planet, and so we don't damage and wound the planet as we have done in the last decades. So I'm going to pass the baton on to my friend Dan. So you're up,
Okay.
Dan.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Um, I just wanted to mention something before we moved on to something that occurred to me just before we started. In the first segment of these talks, we talked about countering mistaken views and then went on to modeling ethical behavior. And in that regard, we talked about the Buddhist values of not harming, generosity, containment, and frugality. But I went off on this kind of long excursion about economics and especially consumerism, because I think Stephanie Kaza is right that consumerism might be the biggest practice field for Buddhists at this time. That is to say, modeling um, understanding of how we are being manipulated by advertising and so on, and helping other people understand that. So it occurred to me that one way to actually accomplish this, there ought to be in all schools, in middle school and high school, a consumer education course. And now this wouldn't, of course, be marketed as we're going to indoctrinate you into socialistic thinking. No, it'd be quite the opposite, but it would be not only to inform people about um, things like banking, for instance, that they need to know about, but also about advertising, how advertising works and how it can manipulate us, because we all need to protect ourselves against that, no matter what your ideology is and so forth. But this would have the effect of making people understand better kind of the forces of dependent arising that are really quite contrary to what we need to be doing to do something about the climate crisis. It's the ideology of continual economic growth, that everybody has to have more and more, and so on. That is the fundamental driver, after all, of all of this, right? So consumer education might be really important. Anyway, today I wanted to go on talking about social resilience. Here it's just the idea is that, of course, we need to change people's minds, but that involves convincing people that climate change is truly important. That's one thing. And another is that we need to provide contemplative practices and small scale projects in which they can participate. But anyway, I wanted to start by acknowledging that when we talk about climate change, um, for many people, it causes them to deny there's any problem. It's actually still shockingly high for how many people this is. And other people, it brings up very troubling emotions. And those troubling emotions get in the way of hearing about what needs to be done, and in the way of the environmentalists who need to deliver the message. Anyway, I'm going to focus on the United States, where the problem is arguably the greatest because we have emitted the most greenhouse gases and we have the most money. And we also have a population that's far from on board for serious efforts. And I'll be drawing largely upon a book by Carrie Norgard of the University of Oregon, who investigated climate change attitudes in Norway first, and then came back to the United States. And she wrote a book called Living in Denial, Climate Change, Emotions, and Everyday Life, which is really pretty good. So now I'll go to the PowerPoint here and hope that it shows up for you the way it ought to. Okay. So Americans, compared to other nations, are fairly ignorant about the larger world. Um, the National Assessment of Education in 2014 found that almost 75% of American students fell short of proficiency in geography. We probably all know people who couldn't point out Ukraine on a map if their lives depended upon it, for instance. And Americans are less engaged. We're notoriously lower in terms of political participation, even though the 2020 election, saw a record turnout. But in general, we're not engaged. And we tend to be distrustful of the government. Only about a quarter of Americans say they can trust the government to do the right thing most of the time. Among Republicans, it's 9%. By comparison, in the 1950s, about 3/4 of Americans trusted the government. And people are distrustful of their fellow citizens and think that most people are too greedy and self-interested to help. About 35% say they have little or no trust in their fellow citizens. And of course, we all know that we are determined to be self-sufficient. We have a culture of American individualism, which, to be fair, is now a defining feature of postmodern society everywhere in the world. We are certain that the American way of life is exceptional and correct. Remember when President George Herbert Walker Bush went to the Rio Summit on climate change in 1992, and he said, "The American lifestyle is not up for negotiation, period." And no president since him has dared to say otherwise. I mean, even Obama, if it's climate change is mentioned, it's about green jobs, green energy, and so forth. It's that, we can turn this problem into more profit, actually, and a higher standard of living for ourselves. Finally, Americans have developed a hostility to expertise. About a quarter of the public routinely dismiss the conclusions of experts. They feel that intellectuals are conceited and snobbish, and very likely immoral and dangerous and subversive. And they think that their own common sense is superior. So that's what we're working with. Anyway, so then it's no surprise that regarding climate change, America is near the bottom of developed nations in terms of how much emphasis we think the government should place. So recent polls show that about half of Americans now think that climate change is an important topic. But that doesn't mean they think the United States government should lead the way. And Americans are also among the highest in the world in literal denial of climate science. In polls taken in 2021, although 50% of Americans regard climate change as a critical threat, 26% said climate change is an important but not critical threat, and another 20% said the phenomenon is not an important threat at all. And of course, as we know, there's a political divide. So among Republicans, only 19% say climate change is an important subject, and so on. And people are willing to fight climate change only if it doesn't cost anything. For instance, in an Associated Press poll published in 2019, only 28% of respondents say that they would be willing to pay an additional $10 per month to fight climate change. You think about that. 72% they would not be willing to pay even $10 a month more to fight climate change. And how about people paying more for gasoline? We established yesterday that its true price, if you stopped subsidizing it or required that externalized costs, the pollution and so forth, be factored in, that gasoline should be $15 a gallon. But people go crazy when the price of a gallon goes over $3. There's no way they're going to pay a lot more. So again, it's a difficult thing we're working with. Of course, younger people, more of them are willing to think it's an important problem, but that doesn't mean that they're that much more likely to do anything, such as making climate change a priority in voting or to writing to members of Congress and so forth. They're still mostly, concerned with their own personal goals and aren't that much more likely than previous generations to want to make sacrifices of any kind. So, the situation is definitely going to get worse. There's no question about that. Will things change? Well, we've had clear evidence about what's happening in the Arctic, We've had wildfires in the West and in Quebec. We've had hurricanes in the East and freezing in Texas. And how much has that changed public opinion? A few points. And it hasn't really changed things in terms of what people are willing to do to like address the situation. So denial is a big thing. Um, there are two basic theories for how people can be in denial despite all the evidence. One is cognitive dissonance, that it's possible for us to hold two completely conflicting ways of viewing things without this affecting our daily lives. Um, so I can know that there's a huge problem with climate change, but believe that it doesn't matter whether I pay any attention to it. And then there's the theory of emotional blocks that the whole subject brings up so much insecurity, fear, and anxiety that people feel a sense of helplessness and guilt, and they shrink back up into themselves to ignore the problem. Ignoring a problem is a way to manage fear and guilt so we don't have to experience helplessness. So we just try to go on with our lives. I mean, I'm sure that we're all familiar with this, and we've all done this too. So she goes further into how to talk about these emotional blocks that we have. So one is that there really aren't any appropriate social spaces for discussing climate change. So local politicians will say, well, yeah, it's a problem, but it's not something that I can do about anything about here at this local level. Or in places like gyms or bars, restaurants, people don't want to talk about morally fraught issues. We want to fit in and be accepted. We don't want to say anything unpopular. And we don't want to frighten children or maybe old people. So teachers don't want to frighten their students too much or rile up their parents. So they're not taking advantage of opportunities to get the younger generation aware of the facts and what needs to be happen. Um, it's also often considered bad manners to express views that differ from those of most other people. Um, and we don't know how to talk to others to convince them. Most people aren't adept enough with the scientific facts to be able to present things to their friends or other people and really feel authoritative about it because it's a complicated subject, right? Um, and we don't want to seem weak. You don't want to make yourself seem helpless, insecure, stupid, and everything. You want to seem cool and not too serious about anything. Um, and we're afraid of the consequences of contradicting people, right? Because there's a lot of people who are hostile to conversations about climate change. Um, if you're a Democrat, can you talk to a Republican or vice versa? It's very fraught these days. So, this would be a topic that you avoid with people whose political views you're not sure are exactly the same as your own. Um, and we've seen politicians get death threats for holding views like that. And then finally, privilege is an issue because, it isolates people from the moral complexities of climate change. For people in privileged positions, it's awkward and embarrassing to think about the moral complexities of climate change. So it's a difficult thing. That's all I wanted to say here. And this is just a brief detour. Mary Eaton studied environmentalists and talked about the problems that they are dealing with. And of course, you wouldn't be surprised to know that people who think about climate crisis all the time suffer from sadness, anger, fatigue, depressive symptom, and even disbelief or denial themselves, which could lead to even more drinking, drug use, and even suicide. I just want to inject a personal note here. In 2010, I participated in a week-long workshop in New Mexico. It was my introduction to teaching about climate change. It was held at the Lama Foundation, which is a deliberately primitive place on the side of a mountain in New Mexico. And we gathered in this geodesic dome that was built in the late 1960s. Anyway, the organizers went over the week schedule, and then they asked whether there were any topics that should be incorporated. I looked, and a hand went up, and the person said, grief, and despair. And I looked around the room and I saw a lot of people nodding. Unlike me, a lot of these people had been teaching about these things for a long time, perhaps even decades, and it had taken its toll on them. Um, they had come to the workshop to get new ideas, but they also needed to commiserate with others. Anyway, it was sobering to see that. So, strategies for relieving stress. Thich Nhat Hanh has said, the best way to take care of the environment is to take care of the environmentalist. I mean, that sounds almost like nonsense, but like everything else he says, it condenses a world of wisdom. So, burned out people aren't much good for anybody. If we take on the burden of thinking and acting and talking about climate change, we're going to need strategies for self-care. So, you know, sharing stories, writing, all these things here that might be done and then shared with other people. Um, anyway, optimism may be too much to ask, but we can have active hope. And I'll get a little bit more into that. That's a phrase that Joanna Macy came up with for someone to have not an optimistic view, but a view of resolution. So talking about taking that on. So bodhisattvas vow to relieve the suffering of sentient beings. But the question is, how can they do all that and not be crushed by it? So, as many writers have pointed out, if you understand emptiness, if you understand dependent arising, you can understand the pain of others without feeling that pain. Compassion does mean to suffer with, but, really to be effective, you need to understand exactly how people are feeling pain. And you take that, but you don't apply it and make yourself feel pain at the same time. It's a tricky sort of business, but of course, it's the sort of thing that therapists and physicians have to do all of the time so as not to burn out. So anyway, those of us who aren't bodhisattvas will take on pain, and then we can avoid burnout maybe by thinking about deep time. But well, so if you believe in karma and rebirth, then you realize that this is just one in a chain of many, many lifetimes. But the philosopher Shantideva back in the 7th century also reflected on the fact that the suffering can have a positive value, a benefit. For instance, it humbles us, removing arrogance and selfishness. It awakens our compassion for others because now we can see ourselves in the same boat as them and understand what they're feeling because of what we are feeling ourselves. Um, and if we can take it on and stay with it, it will make us stronger in the end. I mean, it's sort of like Nietzsche's famous phrase, what does not kill me makes me stronger. And it can motivate us to be virtuous and also to seek enlightenment. And going a little bit further, Joanna Macy, as I said, is a powerful advocate for facing the pain of the world. And like Shantideva, she looks at the positive side of it. It can bond us with others, and it can facilitate a disintegration of the self, but of the false sense of self that's at the root of fear and selfishness. So she had this moment in 1978 when she saw already what was coming. I mean, people have been seeing this climate crisis coming for many decades already. And at a seminar in Notre Dame University, she said, we knew that it had something to do with the readiness to face the dark and take that darkness into us. And it had to do, in other words, with a willingness to acknowledge and experience pain, and that this pain for the world, like pain for the loss of a loved one, is a measure of caring. We also knew that the joint journey into the dark had changed us, bonding us in a special way. So for her, this led into what she called the despair and empowerment workshops, and later on, what she called the work that reconnects. So the wholesale changes ahead may cause disintegration of the self, but it could be a positive disintegration. It could bring about a new collective consciousness. Um, anyway, so as not to harm ourselves psychologically, we need to disidentify with some particular part of ourselves. For instance, anger. Although, you and I might be angry at this situation. We're angry at people for not waking up. We're angry at politicians for not acting. Um, I can realize that I am not just an angry person. I am many other things as well. The anger can be something I display rather than something that is my inner state, um, which is one of the reasons why Tantric Buddhism is such an effective tool for some people is that it does this kind of dance of disidentifying with um, the darker side that we have inside of us, the shadow, Jung called it, of our anger, our shame, our guilt, and our lust and so forth, and turning it on its head. Um, well, I just want to come up with one more topic for today, which is, well, what if it's too late? So a number of people, Sean Kelly, Thich Nhat Hanh, David Loy, Karen Myers, and others have been contemplating this question. What do Buddhists do in the face of what really may be the end? So I've mentioned this quote from E.O. Wilson before. It may be a law of evolution that an intelligent species will sooner or later snuff it out. And then this corollary that we may not have experienced extraterrestrial life because any species that becomes technologically capable of interstellar travel would have to pass through a period like ours, where it wrecks the very basis upon which travel would happen. So, it doesn't happen. That's it. That's the case. Anyway, I wanted to give you this quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, which is really quite thought-provoking. We must accept the death of civilization if we're going to find answers, because until we have accepted the worst, we will be too fearful to see what we must do. So he says, we have destroyed forests and wildernesses. The oceans are rising and thousands of species are becoming extinct. This gives rise to anxiety and despair. From the perspective of nature and of the universe, there is no worry and anxiety because the nature of everything is no increasing, no decreasing, right? When you go down to the cosmic level, that's the case. It's just a change in one form to another. There's no extra, there's no loss. Anyway, throughout the Earth's history, civilizations have been destroyed because they did not know how to live in harmony with each other and with nature. Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, by the way, is a great book for, specific cases in which this has happened many times. It may take a few million years, but the Earth will recover, heal, and establish balance. For Mother Earth, nothing is increasing or decreasing. Then, most of us try to cover up our fear. Most of us are afraid of looking directly at our fear. The Buddha proposed that you bring the seed of fear up and look at it head on. So we have to accept the death of our civilization. We have to accept reality as it is. Once we are freed from the fear and the terror of our civilization being destroyed, we will know exactly what to do. We will be able to come together and apply the solutions available to us to save our planet. So I'd like to hear what you all have to say in a few minutes. But just to kind of finish this up, there's a new academic field called collapsology, in which people write papers about how the collapse of civilization will happen and how we might adapt. So this is Jem Bendel, a scholar in the UK, who wrote a paper rather called Deep Adaptation, and these were the 4 points of this kind of deep adaptation: resilience, the capacity to change to changing circumstances; relinquishment, that meaning letting go of certain assets, behaviors, and beliefs; restoration, rediscovering attitudes and approaches to life and organization; and finally, reconciliation, reconciliation with one's own death, including any difficulties and regrets in one's life, any anger towards existence itself, or anger against God. It also invites reconciliation between peoples, genders, classes, generations, countries, religions, and so forth. So could that happen? One person who believes it is Sean Kelly, professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He reflects that when people get a terminal diagnosis, they often want to reconcile with others, to confess, to ask forgiveness, to offer forgiveness, and so on. So he thinks this may turn out to be a time of reconciliation between all the people who are now at odds with each other. The key is seeing that the world we knew is not coming back. And so what's the point of all these dualities and hierarchies? And perhaps there could be a new kind of religion too. This one wouldn't center on supernatural beings or on secular consumerism, but rather on recognizing dependent arising, with which everyone would be very familiar. This, of course, is exactly what Buddhism suggests and what we just have been discussing, all throughout the things so far. So anyway, I'll stop there for today. Whoops, that's not what I meant to do. I'll stop there so that we can talk about this a bit before we end today. And so I hope that there was some provocative stuff in what I said today.
Thank you, Dan, again, it's wonderful to hear you, and actually brilliant the way that you bring this complex matter and simplifies it in a way that is digestible to us. So I really appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to your next presentation. I'm going to stop recording now.